Joining us now, we have managing editor at The Bulwark, Sam Stein, staff writer at The New Yorker, Susan Glasser, and opinion columnist for The Washington Post, Dana Milbank. Thank you all for being with us this morning. Sam, let's start with you. In this Time magazine interview, Donald Trump seemed to be admitting that he understands that campaigning is easy, governing is hard, and prices of groceries, something he was obsessed with all year long, will be a difficult challenge.
Yeah, I mean, the interview was a tonal shift for Trump, obviously, going from saying he will definitely bring down prices to, I think I can bring them down, but it's going to be hard. Clearly a rhetorical backtrack. And look, this happens, obviously, but it should be an insult to the people who voted for Trump based on the price of groceries. His policies, as basically every economist will say, are inflationary. If you're going to launch trade wars, if you're going to jack up tariffs with foreign countries, including Mexico and Canada, which he's already threatened to do, that will have inflationary effects. If you're going to launch a mass deportation upon entering office, which he said he's going to do, that will have a direct impact on the price of groceries. And so at some point the rubber hits the road, and it looks like, to me at least, this Time magazine interview was an attempt for him to start to recalibrate the expectations of his own supporters, who were promised very explicitly that prices would come down.
So even though the president-elect is backing away from some key promises, like to lower the cost of groceries, he's also claiming a number of preemptive victories on some other issues. Dana, as you point out in the Washington Post, the president-elect doesn't take over for 6 more weeks, but magically, he has already made America great again. You write in part this: he has solved the border crisis. Mexico's president has agreed to stop migration through Mexico and into the United States, effectively closing our southern border, Trump tells us. This will go a long way towards stopping the illegal invasion of the USA. He has brought peace to the Middle East. Former NATO chief says Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire a direct result of incoming Trump administration, was the headline Trump posted on his fledgling social media site on Monday. He has scored a breakthrough against the opioid epidemic. He announced that he has secured the commitment of the Canadian government to work with us to end this terrible devastation of U.S. families. And he has already turned the U.S. economy into the envy of the world. The stock market just recorded its best month this year in the wake of Trump's landslide victory, proclaimed the headline of another Trump social media post. So, Dana, pretty neat trick here for Trump to take credit for things before he actually wields the levers of power. Tell us more about what you found. But is there any truth to the idea that just the looming presence of Trump might be changing at least some things? Maybe not the victories he's claiming, but at least some things both at home and abroad.
Well, sure, Jonathan, it may be changing things at the margin in terms of the way allies and foreign governments act. But, basically what's happened here is the fantasy that Trump portrayed on the campaign trail is colliding with reality here. I mean, look, he said we're a failed nation. And now he's going to inherit this supposedly failed nation. But well, what's he going to do then? I mean, on day one, most likely, he's going to proclaim victory and start talking about all the greatness of America. And it's fairly easy to do since America didn't stop being great in the first place. Now, it's kind of a neat trick, except that his supporters seem perfectly willing, like they're in on the joke to some extent. As soon as Trump was elected, you saw the poll swing. Suddenly, Republican voters were saying they're optimistic about the economy. Things aren't so bad after all. So it was a charade going on that a number of Trump's own supporters were in on. So at some point you have to adjust to the reality of the situation, which is that our country is not the disaster he portrayed it to be. So why not sort of preemptively take credit for it?
Dana, you had an interesting podcast yesterday about Americans just not believing in experts anymore. What has to happen for experts to win back any faith in their solutions and in their process?
Gosh, I can profess to you right now that I am not an expert on anything. But look, this is a much bigger problem than what we're having at the moment. You're seeing it in the Trump confirmation battles, where qualifications really aren't important, and I think that's an extension of sort of a rejection of expertise. But this has been years and years in the building. It's been a discrediting of traditional media. It's hand in hand with the sort of anything goes alternative facts universe. So I wish I could say that there's a solution. It just seems to me that we're going to have more of these collisions with reality. And unfortunately, we're going to have to presumably see some disastrous results during the Trump presidency that would make people rethink their predispositions.
So, Susan, in your latest piece for The New Yorker, titled "Donald Trump is Picking Fights, Will Anyone Hit Back?" in which you talk about the ways you see leaders appear to be capitulating to the president-elect instead of standing up to him. Tell us more about what you found.
Well, look, obviously there was a lot of surprise, I think, that greeted the decision this week by Chris Wray to preemptively announce his resignation from the FBI rather than waiting for Donald Trump to fire him on the spurious grounds of essentially not being personally loyal to Donald Trump himself. I think there is a robust debate about how best to deal with the challenge of Donald Trump coming in, here in Europe at a conference. And, this is at a moment when officials in NATO, allied governments are extremely nervous about Trump coming in. They're worried about him making a peace deal with Russia, essentially on Putin's terms, that would potentially undermine the NATO alliance. In the past, Trump has threatened to walk out of NATO altogether. What are they doing? They're preemptively signaling, well, hey, we're going to raise our targeted spending to 3% of our GDP on defense. But to a certain extent, they're negotiating with themselves at this point. Trump hasn't even taken office. Is that the right thing to do, to mollify Trump, not to get in his sights? Or at the same time, is it a disastrous mistake because then Trump is going to ask for more? You see this to a certain extent with Canada. It was a remarkable thing to me to have the president of the United States openly taunting the leader of Canada, saying, maybe you should just become our 51st state. And what I thought was really interesting was that you didn't hear Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau clap back at Trump and say, hey, wait a minute, not only are we an independent sovereign country, but we may have many advantages over the United States. I mean, that is as insulting as you can get to a foreign government. And I think the response has been notable for how much people are wary of confronting Donald Trump.
And Susan, actually, I completely agree with you. And it goes beyond that even. And you see some of the tech giants who have been in crosshairs with Trump now turning around and donating heavily to his inauguration committee. I'm wondering if we could kind of dig a little deeper in here. What do you think is the sort of psychology happening right now? Because if you think back to 2016 at this time period, going into 2017, if I'm recalling correctly, there was a lot of talk about, how do you fight this? What are the protest movements going to look like? Lawyers are getting ready for the Muslim ban. Obviously, you had immediate pushback, scenes at airports, the Women's March, et cetera, et cetera. I don't sense any of that in talking to Democrats or people who would be involved in the type of pushback you traditionally see. Why do you think that is the case? Are people just worn down by it all?
Yeah, there's so many potential explanations. One of them is sheer exhaustion. We are 8 years into this, not, 1 month, but 8 years and 1 month into it. So exhaustion is a part of it. I think there appears to be a collective conclusion among some of Trump's critics, some of Trump's opponents, that somehow the early resistance framework did not produce the results that they wanted it to. That certainly is notable here in terms of foreign leaders as well. I remember Angela Merkel's statement when Trump was elected, essentially lecturing Trump and saying, I'm going to be on the watch for violations of democracy. You don't see any statements like that this time around from foreign leaders who are eager not to be in Trump's crosshairs. The question is that going to serve as a deterrent to Trump in any way or constraining him in any way, in the sense that while he has so many partners to work with, it's a big question. There are many people who look at what's happened in countries that have gone through Democratic backsliding in recent years, people like the Yale historian Timothy Snyder, they have the frame of, hey, listen, don't obey in advance. And I was just speaking with a leader of the Turkish opposition, interestingly, to Erdogan for all these years. And I asked him about Christopher Wray resigning, and I asked him about, what do you think about this debate that's happening in Washington? He was uncategorical, which is really interesting. He said, don't do it. Don't obey. Fight as long as you can. Don't resign until you absolutely have to. And I just thought it was really interesting that that was the perspective of someone who's been resisting Erdogan's authoritarian moment for a long time in Turkey.
Yeah, a very important moment and an important piece. Staff writer at The New Yorker, Susan Glasser, thank you. We'll be reading that piece. It's online this morning. And Dana, to you here on this idea of resistance, it does seem very different than the aftermath of the 2016 election, at least so far, in terms of the lack of protest movement here at home, the lack of uproar overseas. Do you see things that could change that? I know, at least domestically, there are some Democrats who think that if Trump were to follow through with the mass deportations plan, that might be the spark that changes things. What do you think?
Well, I agree with what Susan was saying about this exhaustion, and you're seeing it. Our newspaper readership is down, your viewership is down. It's I think people, having been through this once, are saying, oh, we have to do it again. And that is the slippery slope that we're talking about. Is it all becomes normalized. We just accept it and say maybe it won't be so bad this time. So what does it take? There's a chance that we'll start to see this when the confirmation hearings begin in January. Some of the more outrageous characters may spark some. You're right, it may be roundups at the border. It may require some other policy failure, setting off a trade war, for example, or it's something we don't know, because if we know anything, that the Trump administration will be unpredictable. So I think there is a chance around the inauguration and in January that energy of the quote-unquote resistance returns. But it is it's a sign of how beaten down I think the left and the never Trump Republicans are, that it's just so quiet right now.